Now, 6 climate activists are being sentenced this afternoon after they invaded the track during last year's British Grand Prix. The protesters from Just Stop Oil were convicted last month of causing a public nuisance. Yeah, which is, I mean, at least, isn't it? During the trial, the prosecution said their actions caused risk to the drivers and officials. Now, TV viewers will be able to see this now, so I'm going to talk you through it. We can see 5 Just Stop Oil protesters sitting on the track at Silverstone, and Formula One cars are whizzing past. They're being forced to slow down, and there's 6 of them who are guilty and are going to be sentenced. The other one was found in a car nearby with glue, cable ties and a Just Stop Oil banner. So, essentially bang to rights, some would say. They were bailed, presumably because they're not a flight risk, and they're going to be sentenced today. I'm joined now by Emma Webb, who's the UK director of the Common Sense Society, which I think these days is a rare thing. Emma, thank you very, very much. What do you expect to happen to this lot? Because they could seriously face a prison sentence, couldn't they?
Well, it's very difficult to say, because if you remember when the Colston 4 were on trial for what they did to the statue of Colston during the Black Lives Matter protest back in 2020, they were actually essentially let off of the hook. And we've seen lots of instances of criminal damage by groups like Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil and other radical progressive groups. And they don't seem to really consistently see justice. So I wouldn't necessarily want to call it. I would like to think that actually they would receive quite a harsh sentence for this, because it's quite clear that they put people's lives at risk. We've seen Just Stop Oil before blocking motorways, stopping emergency service vehicles like ambulances, fire trucks from being able to get to where they need to be, putting people's lives at risk. They clearly think that their cause is more important than human life, as well as property and heritage, as you've seen with them pouring cans of soup over artwork. So I'd like to see them get a really tough sentence, but I'm not completely confident, given the history on this, that they will actually see tough justice. They
will say, though, won't they, that they are trying to protest against arguably the most egregious example of what they are trying to prove, which is a load of rich men riding around in potentially gas-guzzling cars on a world tour of spilling fumes into the atmosphere as other petrol heads shout for more and faster. So they will presumably be saying, this is the most obvious example of the thing that we hate. I mean, have they got a case there? Well, Lewis Hamilton seems to think so, and he drives one of the things.
I mean, Lewis Hamilton's a complete hypocrite, isn't he? They are clearly trying to imitate the suffragettes. They're clearly trying to imitate that famous incident when a suffragette ran onto a horse racing course. But they're not the suffragettes. And actually, this could have really put at risk not only the lives of themselves, but the drivers, those people who were working on the course. They said that they had done extensive research in order to ensure that this was safe, but there would be no purpose in doing this unless it actually posed a serious risk.
No. OK, so, I mean, if they go to prison, though, is there not a risk that they almost become martyrs? Possibly not quite in the same way as if one of those cars had thundered into them at 200 miles an hour, but is there not a risk that they could go down in history? Do they not kind of want to go to prison?
I think we need to balance this with, what could happen otherwise if we don't give them a tough sentence, because I think that repeatedly, not all of the same cause, like I mentioned, Black Lives Matter protesters and criminal damage. I think a lot of these progressive activists have seen that justice isn't done in these cases. They've seen that they can push their luck and get away with it. And what we are seeing as a result is escalation. And there is a real genuine potential threat of this sort of activism developing into eco-terrorism. So we need to be very careful that we draw the boundaries of the law and enforce the law very, very carefully. If we allow them to get away with it, we'll only encourage them to do further acts of criminal damage and potentially putting people's lives at risk, not only their own.
It comes just after a group of quite woke, eco-friendly lawyers decided that they were not going to prosecute any of this lot, despite the fact that none of them, as far as I could tell, would have ever been in a position to prosecute any of them, and one of them did club a fox to death with a baseball bat whilst wearing his wife's kimono one Boxing Day morning. So maybe not the most eco-friendly individual there. But that maybe has buoyed some of these activists to think, well, this is great. We've got the legal community behind us now, and we can just act with impunity. But you alluded to the idea that maybe one day they could be classed as eco-terrorists. And I mean, essentially, that's similar-ish, but not quite the same, as to what happened with Insulate Britain, who are now, of course, in Insulate Prison, aren't they?
Well, I don't think that they are, I'm not suggesting that these people are terrorists, but I'm saying that if we allow people to break the law if there are groups who think that their ideological objectives are more important than the safety of the public. They think that the apocalypse is nigh and that they have to act now, and they will do so at all costs. That obviously poses a risk of escalation, and that's why you need to make sure that you are enforcing the law, because we've seen them doing all sorts of criminal damage, being willing to break the law in pursuit of their objectives. And if that starts to put the public in danger, of course there's a risk of escalation there. So we need to be very careful in managing that risk.
Absolutely.
So if we're talking about whether or not they want to go to prison, whether or not they would become martyrs, I think we need to think about what could really happen on the other hand.